Dismissing her black maid's book as worthless, a millionaire woman is shocked to discover it's an antique worth a small fortune, forcing her to confront her own prejudice. And if you cherish your family and love stories like this, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and avoid 10 years of bad luck. The grand ballroom of Elizabeth Carter's mansion buzzed with the chatter of Manhattan's elite. Crystal chandeliers cast a golden glow over the gathering of CEOs, politicians, and socialites who regularly attended Elizabeth's exclusive soirees. Elizabeth stood at the center, wearing a tailored Chanel suit that cost more than most people's monthly salary, her perfectly manicured hand clutching a champagne flute. "Of course, I've always believed in supporting the staff," Elizabeth announced to her circle of influential friends, her voice carrying just far enough to reach the kitchen door. "But some people simply don't understand the value of real opportunities. Take my housekeeper, for instance." In the kitchen, Maya Johnson's pen moved steadily across the pages of her worn notebook. The sounds of dishes being washed and appetizers being prepared created a steady rhythm behind her as she stole moments between her duties to write. Her notebook, a simple spiral-bound volume from a drugstore, contained 2 years' worth of her novel's drafts. The kitchen door swung open as another server rushed through with empty trays. Maya quickly tucked her notebook into her apron pocket, returning to her tasks. Through the door's window, she could see Elizabeth holding court, her audience laughing at something she'd just said. "I mean, really," Elizabeth's voice drifted in again. "When I offered to help her find a proper position in housekeeping management, she told me she wanted to be a writer. Can you imagine?" The resulting laughter made Maya's cheeks burn, but she kept working. Later that evening, after the guests had departed, Maya sat in her small room in the servants' quarters. A copy of Toni Morrison's Beloved lay open on her bed, its pages dog-eared from multiple readings. The bathroom light in her modest quarters flickered as she pulled out her notebook again, determined to capture the story that had been forming in her mind throughout the day. Elizabeth's voice interrupted her concentration. "Maya, the library needs attending to." She stood in the doorway, surveying the small room with barely concealed disdain. Her eyes landed on the open notebook. "Still wasting time with that silly hobby?" Maya straightened her uniform. "It's not a hobby, Mrs. Carter. I'm working on a novel about." "Dear," Elizabeth cut her off, her tone dripping with condescension. "Let's be realistic. Do you know how many people actually succeed as writers? And in your position?" She left the sentence hanging, its implications clear. The library needs dusting, and the books need to be reorganized. That's a real opportunity to work with literature, isn't it? Maya felt her throat tighten, but managed to maintain her composure. "Yes, Mrs. Carter. I'll take care of it right away." In the library, Maya ran her fingers along the spines of first editions and rare volumes that Elizabeth collected but rarely read. As she dusted, she couldn't help but notice that many of the books remained unopened, preserved more as status symbols than vessels of stories. "You know," Elizabeth said, appearing suddenly in the doorway, "I'm only trying to help you understand your place. Not everyone is meant to be a writer. Some people are meant to take care of writers' homes." She smiled, as if she'd offered sage wisdom rather than another thinly veiled insult. Maya nodded silently, continuing her work. In her pocket, her notebook pressed against her hip, a constant reminder of her dreams. She had learned long ago that responding to Elizabeth's comments only invited more criticism. Instead, she channeled her frustrations into her writing, transforming them into fuel for her character's Joe. Anise. The evening ended with Maya returning to her quarters, exhausted but determined. She pulled out her notebook once more, adding new scenes inspired by the day's events. Unknown to both women, this manuscript would soon become the catalyst for a dramatic shift in their relationship, though neither could have predicted how or why. The morning Mr. James Alcott visited the mansion marked a turning point. He arrived precisely at 10 a.m., his wire-rimmed glasses fogged from the autumn chill, carrying a leather briefcase that had seen better days. As one of New York's most respected rare book collectors, his presence had Elizabeth practically vibrating with excitement. "Mr. Alcott, welcome to my humble collection," Elizabeth said, leading him through the mansion's marble foyer. Maya stood quietly in the background, having been instructed to serve tea and remain invisible otherwise. I've recently acquired several first editions I believe will interest you. The library doors open to reveal floor-to-ceiling shelves of leather-bound books, their spines gleaming in the morning light. Elizabeth immediately launched into a rehearsed tour, pointing out various rare editions she'd purchased at exclusive auctions. Mr. Alcott followed politely, though his eyes kept wandering to the less prominent shelves. "Here we have a first edition Hemingway," Elizabeth declared, carefully removing a volume from its shelf. The dust jacket is in pristine condition, and she paused, noticing that Mr. Alcott had drifted away from her, his attention caught by something in a corner shelf. "What's this?" he asked, reaching for a dusty manuscript bound in simple black cloth. Maya's heart stopped. She recognized it immediately as one of her earlier drafts, left behind during cleaning. She'd been searching for it for weeks. Elizabeth frowned, clearly annoyed at the interruption of her presentation. "Oh, that's nothing important. Just some old papers. Now, about the Hemingway." But Mr. Alcott had already opened the manuscript, his experienced eyes scanning the pages with increasing interest. "This is remarkable," he muttered more to himself than to his hosts. He continued reading, oblivious to Elizabeth's attempts to redirect his attention. Maya stood frozen, tea tray trembling slightly in her hands. She watched as Mr. Alcott moved to sit in one of the leather armchairs, completely absorbed in her words. Minutes ticked by in uncomfortable silence. Finally, he looked up, his eyes searching the room until they landed on Maya. "Who wrote this?" Before Maya could speak, Elizabeth intervened. "Oh, that's just some scribbles from my housekeeper. She fancies herself a writer." Her laugh held a note of dismissal, but Mr. Alcott didn't seem to notice. "Your housekeeper?" He turned to Maya directly. "You wrote this?" Maya squared her shoulders, feeling Elizabeth's sharp gaze. "Yes, sir. It's a draft of my novel." "This is extraordinary work," Mr. Alcott said, his voice filled with genuine enthusiasm. "The way you've captured the intergenerational trauma of slavery through a contemporary lens, the metaphorical use of house cleaning as a commentary on societal power structures. This is precisely the kind of fresh voice the literary world needs." Elizabeth's perfectly composed expression faltered. She moved closer, trying to peek at the manuscript she'd ignored for months. "Really? I always knew Maya had potential." Mr. Alcott stood up, clutching the manuscript carefully. "Ms. Johnson, I would very much like to show this to some colleagues of mine at Riverside Publishing. With your permission, of course." Maya's hands gripped the tea tray tighter. Yes, of course." "Wonderful." He reached into his briefcase, producing a business card. "I'll have my assistant contact you directly to discuss the details." Elizabeth watched this exchange with growing unease, her prized first editions forgotten. The power dynamic in her library had shifted unexpectedly. Why? And for the first time, she seemed unsure of her footing. As Mr. Alcott prepared to leave, his attention remained focused on Maya. "Keep writing," he advised. "You have a gift." He nodded politely to Elizabeth, who forced a smile that didn't reach her eyes. The moment the front door closed, Elizabeth turned to Maya, her expression unreadable. The manuscript's discovery had created a crack in their carefully maintained social hierarchy, and neither woman was quite sure what would emerge from it. Maya clutched Mr. Alcott's business card, its embossed letters pressing into her palm like a key to a door she'd always dreamed of opening. The library, usually Elizabeth's domain of power, suddenly felt different, as if the books themselves were witnessing a change in the story. 3 days after Mr. Alcott's visit, the first reporter showed up at Elizabeth's mansion. By the end of the week, there was a constant stream of media vehicles parked along the pristine driveway, their satellite dishes and cameras disrupting the elegant landscape Elizabeth had carefully cultivated for decades. The New York Times is in the foyer, the New Yorker wants an exclusive, and NPR is setting up equipment in the garden. Elizabeth's personal assistant rattled off, struggling to maintain order. The mansion's phone lines hadn't stopped ringing since Riverside Publishing's press release announced the discovery of a groundbreaking manuscript by an unknown domestic worker. Elizabeth paced her study, watching through the window as another news van pulled up. She'd always craved media attention, but not like this. The reporters weren't interested in her charity galas or her art acquisitions. They wanted Maya. Mrs. Carter, Maya knocked on the study door. Channel 7 is asking for a joint interview. Elizabeth turned, her expression tight. Well, of course they are. I've always supported the arts, after all. This is exactly the kind of philanthropic work I'm known for. She smoothed her silk blouse, already moving toward the door. We should coordinate our statements. I'll explain how I've mentored you. Actually, Maya interrupted, her voice steady despite her racing heart. They want to interview me first. Alone. The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken tension. Elizabeth's smile flickered but held. Alone? But surely they'll want to know about your journey here, working in my home, learning from... They want to know about the book, Maya said simply. About why I wrote it, what inspired it. She paused, then added, about what it's like being a black woman writing about generational trauma while working in a white household. Elizabeth's smile disappeared completely. I see. She moved to her desk, suddenly very interested in organizing already neat papers. Well, do be careful with the press, Maya. They can be quite manipulative. Perhaps I should sit in, just to make sure. The interview is in 10 minutes, Maya said, already backing toward the door. In the garden. Out in the carefully manicured garden, under the warm lights of the camera crew, Maya sat straight-backed in her chair. She'd changed out of her uniform into a simple blue dress she'd bought for church. The interviewer, a young black woman from Channel 7, leaned forward with genuine interest. So, Maya Johnson, tell us about your manuscript. What compelled you to write this story? From her study window, Elizabeth watched the interview unfold. She saw Maya's initial nervousness melt away as she began speaking about her work. The camera crew kept adjusting their angles, trying to capture the stark contrast between Maya's modest presence and the opulent mansion behind her. The themes of visibility and invisibility run throughout your novel, the interviewer noted. Were these inspired by your experiences? Maya's response carried clearly through the open window. When you're a domestic worker, you become part of the furniture. People talk around you, about you, through you. Boo! Never to you. I wanted to explore what happens when the furniture starts telling its own stories. Elizabeth's fingers tightened around her coffee cup. She watched as Maya handled question after question with growing confidence, speaking about literature and social justice with an eloquence that seemed to surprise everyone except Maya herself. By evening, social media was buzzing with clips from the interview. Hashtag Maya Johnson was trending, along with phrases like domestic worker turned literary sensation and voice of a generation. Book industry insiders were already predicting a bidding war for the manuscript. The Washington Post wants to do a feature, Elizabeth's assistant announced during dinner. They're particularly interested in the contrast between, she hesitated, glancing at Elizabeth, between Mrs. Carter's traditional literary collection and Maya's contemporary voice. Elizabeth pushed away her barely touched plate. Enough. I need to make some calls. She stood abruptly, but paused at the dining room door. And Maya? Tomorrow you'll need to catch up on your regular duties. The media attention doesn't change your employment status. Maya nodded, but there was a new steadiness in her gaze that made Elizabeth uncomfortable. Both women understood that something fundamental had shifted, but neither was prepared for how this change would force them to confront their own prejudices and presumptions. That night, as Maya fielded more interview requests and messages from literary agents, Elizabeth sat alone in her library. The empty space on the shelf where Maya's manuscript had been seemed to mock her, a visible reminder that sometimes the most valuable things can be hidden in plain sight, overlooked by those too privileged to look closer. Elizabeth called the press conference without consulting Maya. The mansion's grand ballroom, usually reserved for charity galas and political fundraisers, was packed with reporters and cameras. Elizabeth stood at the podium, wearing her most photogenic suit, her media-trained smile firmly in place. As many of you know, I've always been a patron of the arts, Elizabeth began, her voice carrying the practiced warmth she reserved for public appearances. When I first hired Maya Johnson, I recognized something special in her. That's why I created an environment where she could pursue her writing, providing her with access to my extensive library and the flexibility to develop her craft. In the back of the room, Maya watched, her hands clenched at her sides. She wore her uniform. Elizabeth had insisted it would make for better optics, showing her journey from domestic worker to writer. Every word from Elizabeth's mouth twisted the truth into something unrecognizable. Moving forward, Elizabeth continued, I'm excited to announce that I'll be taking an active role in Maya's literary career. We've already discussed establishing a foundation to support other domestic workers with literary aspirations. The Elizabeth Carter Literary Initiative will— Excuse me, Maya's voice cut through the room. She moved forward, aware of every camera turning to follow her progress. Mrs. Carter, I wasn't informed about any foundation. Elizabeth's smile remained fixed, but her eyes hardened. Maya, dear, we discussed this yesterday, remember? About how we'd work together to help others like yourself? No, Maya said firmly, now standing at the edge of the stage. We didn't discuss anything, just like we didn't discuss this press conference. The reporters shifted forward in their seats, sensing a story far juicier than Elizabeth's planned narrative. Phones came out, recording every moment. Perhaps this isn't the best time, Elizabeth started, but Maya was already climbing the steps to the stage. I want to be clear, Maya said, addressing the reporters directly. Mrs. Carter didn't nurture my writing. She actively discouraged it. The manuscript Mr. Alcott discovered was hidden away on a shelf B. Because Mrs. Carter told me to stop wasting time on silly hobbies and focus on my cleaning duties. The room erupted with questions. Camera flashes exploded like lightning. Elizabeth grabbed Maya's arm, trying to guide her away from the podium, but Maya stood her ground. You can't do this, Elizabeth hissed under her breath. I gave you opportunities. You gave me a job, Maya corrected, loud enough for the microphones to pick up. I gave myself permission to dream bigger than you thought I deserved. Elizabeth's composure finally cracked. I let you live in my home. I paid you well. And this is how you repay my generosity? By humiliating me in front of the press. No, Mrs. Carter, Maya said, her voice steady despite her racing heart. I'm simply refusing to let you rewrite my story to make yourself the hero. The reporters were on their feet now, shouting questions. Mrs. Carter, did you really discourage Maya's writing? Maya, will you continue working as a housekeeper? Mrs. Carter, what's your response to allegations of taking credit for Maya's success? Elizabeth's face had gone pale. She looked around the room, seeing not the usual admiring faces of her social circle, but sharp-eyed reporters eager to expose the truth behind her carefully constructed facade. This press conference is over, she announced, her voice shaking slightly. She turned to Maya, dropping her public persona entirely. You're fired. No, Mrs. Carter, Maya replied, pulling her house keys from her pocket and placing them on the podium. I quit. The headlines the next day were brutal. Socialite exposed. The truth behind the literary sensation. Maya Johnson speaks out. I wrote my story despite, not because of my employer. Elizabeth Carter's attempted appropriation of domestic workers' success backfires. That evening, Maya sat in her small room, packing her belongings. Through the window, she could hear Elizabeth arguing with her PR team about damage control. The mansion that had been her workplace for years suddenly felt like a prison she was finally escaping. Her phone buzzed with a message from Mr. Alcott. Riverside Publishing wants to meet tomorrow. Your journey is just beginning. Maya zipped up her suitcase, taking one last look around the servants' quarters. In her notebook, she had already started writing about this day, transforming her anger and hurt into something powerful. Elizabeth had tried to make herself the author of Maya's success story, but Maya had reclaimed her narrative, word by word, truth by truth. The Harlem Writers Collective met in a renovated brownstone on 125th Street. Maya stood outside, clutching her notebook, watching members arrive. They moved with a confidence she envied. Writers who owned their identity without apology. A text message lit up her phone screen. Another demand from Elizabeth's lawyers about a non-disclosure agreement. She switched off her phone. You must be Maya Johnson, a woman called out from the doorway. She introduced herself as Dr. Angela Robinson, founder of the collective. We've been following your story. Come in. Inside, the space hummed with creative energy. Bookshelves lined the walls, filled not with expensive first editions, but with well-worn volumes by James Baldwin, Audre Lorde, and Toni Morrison. Writers sat in clusters, laptops open, manuscripts spread across tables. "Welcome to your people," Dr. Robinson said, leading Maya to a group of writers. "Everyone, this is Maya Johnson," the writer Elizabeth Carter tried to silence. The introduction sparked immediate responses. Writers shared similar stories of working for wealthy employers who dismissed their ambitions. A novelist described cleaning houses while writing her first book. A poet talked about being told to stay in her lane by former employers. "You're not alone," Dr. Robinson assured Maya. "And more importantly, you don't need Elizabeth Carter's permission to tell your story." Meanwhile, across town, Elizabeth H. sat in her empty mansion, scrolling through social media. Her carefully curated image was unraveling. Society friends had stopped calling. Charity boards were quietly dropping her name from committees. The silence in her house, once a symbol of privilege, now felt suffocating. She opened her laptop, typing Maya Johnson Writer into the search bar. Photos appeared from the Writers Collective, showing Maya surrounded by supportive faces, looking more confident than she ever had in the mansion. Elizabeth clicked through articles analyzing her own behavior. The Modern Plantation, how wealthy white women continue to exploit black creativity. Elizabeth Carter scandal exposes systemic issues in domestic work, from service to storytelling. Maya Johnson's rise despite employers' attempts to silence her. Back at the Collective, Maya worked with a copyright lawyer who volunteered her services. "Your manuscript is legally yours," the lawyer explained. "Mrs. Carter has no claim to it, despite her attempts to suggest otherwise." Writers from the Collective helped Maya polish her manuscript. They recognized its power, but encouraged her to dig deeper, to write the truths she'd been afraid to tell while living under Elizabeth's roof. "There's still hesitation in these passages," Dr. Robinson noted, pointing to specific pages. "You're protecting her. Even now. Why?" Maya stared at her writing. "I guess, part of me still feels like I owe her something." "You owe her nothing," another writer interjected. "She paid you for cleaning her house, not for your dignity or your voice." As weeks passed, Maya's manuscript grew stronger. The Collective helped her secure an agent who understood her vision. Publishers began making offers, attracted by both the controversy and the genuine literary merit of her work. Elizabeth watched these developments from afar. Her PR team suggested various strategies: a public apology, a charitable donation to support Black writers, a carefully worded statement about growth and learning. She rejected them all, retreating further into her mansion. One evening, while Maya workshopped chapters with the Collective, Dr. Robinson mentioned an upcoming literary event. "We want you to be our keynote speaker," she said. "It's time to share your story, your way." Maya hesitated. What if Elizabeth shows up? She still has connections in the literary world. "Then she'll hear your truth," Dr. Robinson replied. "Your voice matters more than her discomfort." That night, Maya sat in her new apartment, small but her own, working on her speech. Her phone showed more missed calls from Elizabeth's lawyers, but also messages of support from her new community. The contrast couldn't have been clearer. In her mansion, Elizabeth received an invitation to the literary event. Her first instinct was to dismiss it, but something made her pause. For the first time, she began to see her actions through eyes other than her own. The realization of her behavior started to sink in, but pride and decades of privilege made it hard to acknowledge her wrongs. The invitation sat on her desk, a bridge between two worlds. One where she had always been the patron, the authority, the voice that mattered, and another where voices like Maya's were finally being heard, with or without her blessing. The choice to attend would require more than just showing up. It would demand a complete reconstruction of everything she thought she knew about power, privilege, and the stories we tell ourselves about who deserves to be heard. The rehearsal for the literary event took place in an auditorium at Columbia University. Maya stood at the podium, practicing her speech while members of the Writers Collective offered feedback from the seats. The space buzzed with activity. Sound technicians checking microphones, volunteers arranging chairs, student journalists hovering around the edges hoping for interviews. No one noticed Elizabeth Carter slip into the back row. "So, you look different," less polished, more human. Her designer clothes had been replaced by a simple black pantsuit, her usual elaborate jewelry absent. She sat quietly, watching Maya command the stage with growing confidence. When we silence stories, Maya's voice carried through the hall. We don't just silence words. We silence truth. We silence history. We silence. She stopped mid-sentence, finally spotting Elizabeth in the shadows. The room fell silent. Dr. Robinson stood up, ready to intervene. Other writers shifted protectively closer to the stage. "Mrs. Carter," Maya said into the microphone, her voice echoing through the now silent auditorium. "I didn't expect to see you here." Elizabeth stood, aware of the hostile stares from the collective members. "I can leave if you want. Why are you here?" Maya's question cut through the tension. Elizabeth moved forward slowly, stopping halfway down the aisle. "I've been reading about privilege, about voice, about—" She paused, struggling with words that had never been part of her vocabulary. "About systemic racism in domestic work." Skeptical murmurs rippled through the collective members. Dr. Robinson watched carefully, her expression guarded. "It's not enough," Elizabeth continued, her voice shaking slightly. "Reading, I know that, but I'm trying to understand why." She gestured helplessly. "Why I did what I did. Why I thought I had the right to control your story." Maya descended from the stage, moving closer but maintaining a careful distance. "You try to make my success about you." "Yes," Elizabeth admitted. The simple acknowledgement seemed to cost her something. "I've spent my whole life being the center of every story. The patron, the benefactor, this savior." She spoke the last word with visible disgust. "I never questioned it until now. Until you got caught," someone from the collective called out. Elizabeth flinched but nodded. "Yes, until I got caught. Until I had to see myself through other people's eyes. Through Maya's eyes." She reached into her bag and pulled out a folder. "These are papers from my lawyers. Release forms, dissolving any claims I might have made about your work. Not that I had any right to make claims in the first place." She placed the folder on a nearby seat. "And a letter, admitting everything. How I treated you. How I tried to take credit. How I failed as a human being." The silence in the auditorium grew heavier. Maya looked at the folder, but didn't move to take it. "I don't expect forgiveness," Elizabeth added quickly. "I don't deserve it. I needed you to know that your words changed me. Your courage changed me. Even if it's too late." Maya studied her former employer. The woman who had made her feel small now seemed diminished herself, stripped of her usual armor of wealth and social position. "It's not too late to learn," Maya said finally. "But you can't just sit in the back and watch. If you want to understand, you need to listen, really listen, to everyone's stories, not just mine." Elizabeth glanced around the auditorium at the faces watching her, black writers who had their own experiences with people like her. Would it be inappropriate if I stayed? For the rehearsal?" Dr. Robinson stepped forward. "You can stay, but not in the back. Sit where we can see you, where you have to see us." Elizabeth moved to a seat in the middle of the auditorium, conspicuously alone. Maya returned to the podium, her speech notes trembling slightly in her hands. But when she spoke again, her voice was stronger, more determined. As Maya continued her speech, Elizabeth listened, really listened. She heard the pain behind the words, the generations of silenced voices, the weight of expectations and limitations placed on black women by people like her. She heard the strength, the resilience, the determination to be heard. For the first time in her life, Elizabeth Carter sat in silence and learned from Omion she had once considered beneath her. It wasn't redemption. That would take much more than one afternoon of listening, but it was a beginning, a crack in the foundation of privilege that had shaped her entire life. And Maya, standing at the podium, felt something shift in the room. Not forgiveness, not yet, but possibility. The possibility that even the deepest wounds could begin to heal if people were willing to face their own truths and listen to others. The planning meetings for the literary event moved from Columbia University to local bookstores and community centers around Harlem. Elizabeth attended each one, sitting quietly at first, then gradually beginning to contribute in small ways. Not leading, not controlling, but supporting. We need media coverage, Dr. Robinson announced during one meeting. The kind that focuses on the writers, not the controversy. Elizabeth raised her hand tentatively, like a student unsure of her place in the classroom. I might be able to help with that. Not by speaking, she added quickly, seeing the concerned looks. But I know people at several publications who would be interested in profiling the collective's writers. Maya watched her former employer navigate this new territory. Elizabeth's usual commanding presence had been replaced by something more cautious, more considered. She took notes during discussions about representation in publishing. She listened without interrupting when writers shared stories of discrimination and marginalization. The venue's too small, Maya said during another meeting. We've got twice as many people interested as we have seats. I might know a solution, Elizabeth offered. The Plaza Hotel's Grand Ballroom. I'm on the board, and they owe me a favor. She paused, then added, but it's just a suggestion. I understand if you'd prefer a different location. Dr. Robinson considered it. The plaza's not exactly accessible to our community. What if, Elizabeth said slowly, we arrange transportation, buses from different neighborhoods, and use the money saved on venue rental to provide stipends for emerging writers to attend? The room fell silent, surprised by the practical suggestion that actually considered community needs. Maya spoke up. That could work, but we need to be clear that this isn't about bringing people to a wealthy white space. It's about claiming that space for our voices. Elizabeth nodded. Of course, and any press coverage should focus on the writers and their work, not on. She gestured to herself. Not on any narrative of redemption or white saviorism. Over the following weeks, a tentative partnership emerged. Elizabeth used her connections to open doors, but she let others walk through them first. She arranged meetings with publishers but stayed silent during negotiations. She provided resources but deferred to the collective on how to use them. During one late-night planning session, Maya found Elizabeth alone in the bookstore's coffee shop, reviewing event logistics. You've changed, Maya observed, sitting down across from her. Elizabeth looked up, her expression uncertain. I'm trying to. Sometimes I catch myself falling into old patterns, wanting to take control, thinking I know best. But then I remember. She trailed off. Remember what? How it felt to read your manuscript. Not just the story, but the parts about working in my house. Seeing myself through your eyes. Seeing how I dismissed you, belittled you, tried to keep you in what I thought was your place. Elizabeth's hands tightened around her coffee cup. I was a monster, Maya. You were what society taught you to be, Maya replied. The question is, what are you choosing to be now? Elizabeth considered this. A student, I hope, learning things I should have learned long ago. The conversation was interrupted by Dr. Robinson arriving with updates about the events panel discussions. We need someone to moderate the session on class and privilege. G in publishing, she announced. Elizabeth should do it, Maya said suddenly. Both Elizabeth and Dr. Robinson stared at her in surprise. Not as an expert, Maya clarified. As someone learning, someone who represents the problem, but is actively working to be part of the solution. Elizabeth shook her head. I couldn't. I haven't earned that right. That's exactly why you should, Dr. Robinson said slowly, warming to the idea. Your vulnerability, your willingness to admit ignorance and learn, that might reach people who need to hear it. As the event drew closer, the partnership between Maya, Elizabeth, and the collective deepened. It wasn't perfect. Elizabeth sometimes slipped into old habits of trying to control situations. Some collective members remained skeptical of her involvement. But something new was being built, a model of how privilege could be redirected to support rather than suppress, how power could be redistributed rather than hoarded. The transformation was most visible in the small moments. Elizabeth making coffee runs for late-night planning sessions. Maya feeling comfortable enough to correct Elizabeth's assumptions. Both women learning to work together as equals rather than employer and employee. But beneath this progress, neither woman knew that the past was about to resurface in a way that would test their fragile new relationship. Elizabeth's old scandal was lurking, ready to cast shadows over everything they'd built. The Plaza Hotel's Grand Ballroom had never seen an event quite like this. Instead of the usual society crowd and designer where the space filled with writers, activists, and community members from across New York. Buses organized by Elizabeth had brought people from Harlem, the Bronx, and Brooklyn. The marble columns and crystal chandeliers provided a backdrop for something revolutionary. Maya stood backstage, peering through the curtain. Every seat was filled with people standing along the walls. Her manuscript, now titled Invisible Ink, lay on the podium where she would soon read from it. Television cameras lined the back of the room, and journalists from major publications filled the press section. 5 minutes, Dr. Robinson announced, adjusting Maya's microphone. "Are you ready?" Maya nodded, though her hands trembled slightly. Through the curtain, she could see Elizabeth in the front row, dressed simply in black, her usual flashy jewelry absent. Their eyes met briefly, and Elizabeth gave her an encouraging nod. The event began with Dr. Robinson's introduction. "Tonight, we're not just launching a book. We're celebrating voices that have too long been silenced, stories that have too long gone untold." Maya walked onto the stage, the spotlight catching her face. She placed her manuscript on the podium, took a deep breath, and began to read. In mansions built on hierarchy, truth hides in the spaces between floorboards. It lurks in the corners we're paid to dust, in the margins of books we're not supposed to read. This is a story about power, who has it, who doesn't, and what happens when the voiceless decide to speak. The audience leaned forward, caught by the power of her words. Even the journalists stopped typing, their fingers hovering over keyboards as Maya's voice filled the room. She read for 20 minutes, selecting passages that tracked her protagonist's journey from invisible to visible, from silence to voice. When she finished, the applause was thunderous. People stood, cheering, some wiping tears from their eyes. The moderator for the Q&A session stepped forward, but before she could speak, a voice called out from the audience. "Ms. Johnson, how does it feel to have your former employer in the front row? The same woman who tried to silence you?" The room tensed. This wasn't part of the planned discussion. Maya glanced at Elizabeth, who had gone pale but remained seated, facing forward. "Mrs. Carter is here," Maya said carefully, because she chose to listen. "To earn. That's part of the story too." Another voice. "But isn't her presence here just another form of appropriation? Taking credit for your success?" Elizabeth started to stand, perhaps to leave, but Maya's voice cut through the tension. "No. Her presence here is about accountability, about what happens when privilege confronts its own reflection and chooses to change." The moderator tried to redirect the discussion to the book, but the audience was energized. Questions flew. What about the other domestic workers still trapped in similar situations? How can we trust that her support isn't just damage control? Shouldn't this space be exclusively for marginalized voices? Maya raised her hand for silence. When she spoke, her voice was firm. "My book is about power dynamics in domestic work, yes. But it's also about transformation, about the possibility of change, even for those who have benefited from the system." She looked directly at Elizabeth as she continued. "I won't pretend the past didn't happen, but I also won't ignore genuine efforts to do better. This event isn't about Mrs. Carter's redemption. It's about claiming space for all our stories, including stories of how power can learn to step aside." The room absorbed these words. Elizabeth sat perfectly still, tears visible on her cheeks. Dr. Robinson stepped forward to guide the discussion back to the literary aspects of Maya's work, but something had shifted in the room. The audience had witnessed not just the launch of a powerful new voice in literature, but a real-time demonstration of the complex dynamics Maya's book explored. As the event continued, readings from other collective members followed. Each one powerful, each one necessary. Elizabeth remained in her seat, listening, learning, bearing witness. Her presence, once a symbol of oppression, had become something else, not quite redemption, but perhaps its beginning. The evening ended with a standing ovation that lasted several minutes. Maya stood on stage, surrounded by fellow writers, her manuscript held high. In that moment, she wasn't just a former domestic worker who had written a book. She was a writer who had helped transform a space of privilege into a platform for change. But as the applause faded and the cameras began to pack up, Neither Maya nor Elizabeth knew that tomorrow's newspapers would carry a story that would test everything they'd built. The morning after the event, Maya sat in her apartment reading the reviews. The New York Times called Invisible Ink a searing examination of power and privilege. The New Yorker praised its unflinching honesty. Her phone buzzed constantly with congratulatory messages. Then Dr. Robinson called. "Have you seen page 6? Her voice was tense. "You need to check it now." Maya opened her laptop and found the article. The headline made her stomach drop. Elizabeth Carter's Hidden History. Family fortune built on stolen black art. The article detailed how Elizabeth's grandfather had acquired his prestigious art collection in the 1940s by exploiting black artists, paying them pennies for works he later sold for fortunes. Worse, he had sometimes claimed credit for the pieces himself, erasing the original artists entirely. The family's initial wealth, the foundation of Elizabeth's current fortune, had been built on this systematic appropriation of black creativity. Maya's phone rang again. "Elizabeth, I assume you've seen it," Elizabeth said, her voice raw. "Maya, I need to explain. Did you know?" Maya cut in. "When you were discouraging me from writing, when you were trying to take credit for my work, did you know about your grandfather?" The silence on the other end of the line was answer enough. "I found out when I was 20, Elizabeth finally said. "There were documents in the attic. Letters, receipts, records of payments that wouldn't buy a cup of coffee today for paintings that are now worth millions. And you kept quiet, protected the famo. Why name?" "Yes." Elizabeth's voice cracked. "I told myself it was in the past, that it wasn't my fault, that exposing it would only hurt people who weren't even involved." "People weren't involved?" Maya's voice rose. "Every time I cleaned those paintings in your house, every time you told me to focus on dusting instead of writing, you were continuing exactly what your grandfather started." The line went silent again. When Elizabeth spoke, her words came slowly. "You're right. God, you're right. It's not just inheritance I received, it's patterns, behaviors, ways of seeing or not seeing people." Maya's other line beeped. Publishers calling about statement requests. The story was spreading. "The media is going to want comments," Maya said. "They'll want to know if I knew about this when I agreed to work with you on the event." "I'll handle it," Elizabeth said quickly. "I'll tell them you had no idea, that this is my family's shame, not yours." "No," Maya said firmly. "You don't get to control this narrative either." Her phone kept buzzing. Messages from the Writers Collective were pouring in. "Did you see? We can't stay silent about this. This changes everything," Dr. Robinson texted. "Emergency meeting at the collective. 1 hour." Maya stared at her phone, then at the page 6 article. The parallels were impossible to ignore. Elizabeth's grandfather stealing black artist work. Elizabeth trying to steal Maya's narrative. Different decades, same story. "I have to go," Maya told Elizabeth. "The collective needs to discuss this." "Maya, wait." Elizabeth's voice held genuine panic. "What do you need me to do?" The question hung in the air. Maya thought about their recent progress, the tentative trust they'd built, Elizabeth's efforts to change. But she also thought about the generations of stolen art, stolen stories, stolen credit. "I need you to sit with this," Maya said finally. "Really sit with it. Not just your part, but your family's part. The whole ugly truth of it. And then," she paused, choosing her words carefully, "then we'll talk about what happens next." She hung up, gathering her things for the collective meeting. Her manuscript lay on her desk. Her story, her voice, her truth. But now it was entangled with a larger history of appropriation and erasure. As Maya headed to the meeting, news alerts kept lighting up her phone. More details were emerging. More paintings identified. More artist families coming forward. The story was growing beyond just Elizabeth's grandfather, exposing a systematic practice of exploitation in the art world. Elizabeth sat in her study, surrounded by the paintings she'd grown up with, seeing them with new eyes. Each brushstroke held a story of theft. Each frame contained a history of erasure. Her phone rang constantly, lawyers, PR teams, journalists, but she let them go to voicemail. Instead, she pulled out her grandfather's letters, spreading them on her desk. It was time to face the full truth, no matter the cost to her family's reputation or her own redemption arc. The question now wasn't just whether Maya could continue working with Elizabeth, but whether Elizabeth's attempts at change could outweigh generations of systematic exploitation. The story had grown beyond one manuscript, one relationship, one event. It had become about legacy, responsibility, and the price of real transformation. The press conference room at the Plaza Hotel filled quickly. Journalists muttered among themselves, cameras ready, all eager for the confrontation they expected. Elizabeth Carter and Maya Johnson had called a joint press conference, and no one knew quite what to expect. Elizabeth sat backstage, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. The paintings from her grandfather's collection, worth millions, had been removed from her mansion walls the previous day. Maya entered the room, accompanied by Dr. Robinson and members of the Writers' Collective. "Are you sure about this?" Maya asked Elizabeth quietly. Elizabeth nodded. "It's time." The lights dimmed, and both women walked onto the stage. Instead of sitting far apart, as the journalists clearly expected, they took seats next to each other at the table. "Before we take questions," Elizabeth began, her voice steady, "I have a statement to make." She pulled out a document, laid it flat on the table. "Today, I am announcing the dissolution of the Carter Family Art Foundation. Every piece in our collection that was acquired through exploitation will be returned to the families of the original artists." Camera shutters clicked rapidly. Reporters leaned forward. "Furthermore," Elizabeth continued, "I am establishing a reparation fund using the majority of my inheritance. This fund will be managed entirely by a board of Black artists and writers, with no input from me or any member of the Carter family." Maya watched Elizabeth's face as she spoke. Gone was the socialite who had once dismissed her writing. In her place sat a woman finally confronting her family's legacy of exploitation. A reporter stood. "Mrs. Carter, is this decision related to your recent collaboration with Maya Johnson?" "No," Elizabeth replied. "This decision is related to justice. Working with Maya showed me what it looks like when someone refuses to be silenced. But the responsibility to correct historical wrongs existed long before I met her." Another reporter. "Ms. Johnson, will you continue to work with Mrs. Carter after these revelations?" Maya leaned into her microphone. "My book is about power dynamics and transformation. What we're seeing today isn't just about Elizabeth Carter's personal change. It's about dismantling systems of exploitation. That work continues, whether we work together or not." The questions grew more pointed. "Mrs. Carter, why now? Why not when you first discovered the documents?" "Ms. Johnson, do you feel your story is being overshadowed by this scandal?" "Mrs. Carter, what do you say to accusations that this is just another PR move?" Elizabeth raised her hand for silence. "Let me be clear. I am not the hero of this story. For years, I benefited from and perpetuated systems of oppression. When Maya wrote her book, I tried to control her narrative just as my grandfather controlled those artists' work. The difference is, she refused to be silenced. And in that refusal, she taught me what real courage looks like." Maya spoke next. "Transformation isn't just about individuals. It's about systems. What matters now isn't whether Elizabeth and I remain friends or collaborators. What matters is that stolen art is being returned, that resources are being redirected, that power is being redistributed." A voice from the back. "But can you trust her? After everything?" "Trust isn't the point," Maya replied. "Actions are. Change is. Justice is." Elizabeth stood, pulling another document from her folder. "This is my resignation from every board and committee I serve on. These positions should be filled by voices that have been historically excluded. My role now is to step aside, to make space, to use whatever privilege I have to open doors and then get out of the way." The press conference continued, but something had shifted in the room. The journalists had come expecting drama, conflict, accusations. Instead, they were witnessing something more complex. The messy, difficult work of confronting historical wrongs and attempting to right them. Afterward, in a quiet moment backstage, Maya and Elizabeth faced each other. "What happens now?" Elizabeth asked. "Now," Maya said, "we do the work, separately but parallel. You focus on dismantling what your family built. I focus on building what was denied to people like me. Will you write about this too? Maya smiled slightly. Writers write, Elizabeth. Every story matters, even the uncomfortable ones. Especially those. They didn't hug. They didn't make promises of future collaboration. Instead, they nodded to each other. Two women who age. Ad moved from antagonism to understanding, from conflict to collaboration, and finally to something more important, a shared commitment to change that went beyond personal redemption. As Maya left with the Writers Collective and Elizabeth stayed to meet with lawyers about the dissolution of her family's art collection, both women understood that their individual story had become part of a larger narrative about power, responsibility, and the long, difficult work of transformation. The end wasn't neat or simple. It was complex, ongoing, unfinished, just like the real work of social change. But it was honest, and in that honesty lay the seeds of real transformation. Maya's phone buzzed with a text from her publisher. Ready to start work on your next book? She looked back at the press conference room, where Elizabeth was still answering questions about the reparation fund, and typed a reply. Yes, there are always more stories that need telling.